For those who may not know, this past week, Paul George, who was on the 76ers, he came out saying that he is putting his current podcast, Podcast P, on pause, and says that the intention behind that is to focus on basketball. And just some context on how he is doing this year. He's had a little bit of a dip in his performance. His team is doing pretty badly. They had championship aspirations this year, but they've been plagued by injuries. And so they are not having a great season. They are not really in playoff contention. They seem like their season is done. So here comes Paul George. And this is not me trying to take a jab at him by any means, but he's now saying like, hey, by the way, this podcast that I do, this podcast that a lot of people criticize me for having, I'm actually going to put it on pause for the time being to focus on the season. And so what this has now sparked is kind of this discussion on how do you feel about, well, in this context, we're talking about NBA players, but to y'all, I just want to ask, just generally speaking, athletes who have, or I guess I could say active athletes who have podcasts, do y'all believe that they are a benefit to the sport? Do you believe it takes away from the overall performance, in this case on the court? Do y'all have thoughts on that by any means?
Yeah, I think it's a distraction at the end of the day. Their job as a professional athlete is to go out, practice, and do their work in the games. I think especially with social media and just the amount of constant criticism on TV, social media, Reddit, whatever, like it's just a constant flow of that, and it can be very easy for a player to be distracted by that, take that personally. So for them to have their own platform and kind of contribute in those arenas, to me, is a negative. I mean, you need to be focused, and a podcast or any form of media a player has is just, it's not a good outlet for them to perform at their best, I don't think.
Okay, Dre.
I'm kind of torn on it, honestly. Like, I feel like my instinct is like, yeah, this is a distraction that's kind of unnecessary. That's especially if you're going out of your way to do it, in the sense that, like, say you have a set. Say, like, for example, Podcast P. I don't watch it, so I don't know for sure. But for clips I've seen, it's pretty consistently recorded on a set or like a specific location. So say that's in. Well, even then, he was doing this back in LA, and now he's in Philly. I don't know how it's changed. Say like your set's in Philly, and you have like a 3-game road trip, and you're out of Philly for, I don't know, say you're recording weekly, and then you're out of Philly. If you're flying back just to do the podcast, then I feel like something like that, that's a bit much. But I think if it's just like, because realistically, none of these athletes are like editing the podcast or like doing any of the back end stuff. Like, they're just sitting down for their hour, recording it, and then going about their day, and they have like their team working on it. So if it's just that and you're not going out of your way, I'm not too mad at it. And that's mainly because I think people tend to be results based when it comes to how they criticize these things. Like, I feel like if you're winning the title, like if you're a really good team and you win the title and you've been doing the podcast all year, no one's really gonna say anything. But I feel like if you're struggling like the Sixers are, and you're doing the podcast, it's like, bro, why are you doing this podcast? You should be focused on your game and like helping the team out and doing what you can to get better. So I feel like in that sense, it can be kind of up in the air and a bit more results based than actually the intention, if that makes sense.
100%. And I like that you pointed that out. It is 100% results based. And my thing too is, and I'm speaking within the context of the NBA, right? Right now we're talking about Paul George, right? We're talking about Podcast P. What I will also say is, well, first of all, one of the biggest points of criticism, and it's funny to me because Paul George made this announcement not too long after there was this kind of, I don't even want to call it a headline. I think it came out on Twitter. It was like a post, went viral. A lot of people have kind of just ran with it, but people were saying Podcast P has more clips uploaded since the start of the season in comparison to the amount of field goals that Paul George has made. So Paul George has more podcast clips on his YouTube than field goals made this season. Like, someone really came out with that stat and people ran with it. People have been, just going crazy with that narrative. And not too long after, I see Paul George come out and say, you know what, I'm going to put this podcast on hold. And so, yes, I 100% think if the Sixers were having an amazing season, like Dre said, no one would care to even criticize the podcast. I personally am a big fan of the Knicks. Jalen Brunson and Josh Hart have a podcast, The Roommate Show, and I tune into that pretty consistently. Why? Because I like hearing more about the season directly from the source. So we live in an age of social media where narratives are so easy to for them to be created. Like, people just throw a narrative out there in the NBA world and people run with it. Like Paul George right now, we've seen a lot of players fall victim to it. Kyrie fell victim to it not too long ago. Jason Tatum fell victim to it before he won this title. So I'm saying we live in such a toxic age where it's so easy for players to get caught up in this narrative and garner a reputation that isn't quite justified. But because somebody said it on Twitter, because it went viral, and because people think it holds some power, like, people are going to run with it, right? So in this case, we see people going after Paul George for, quote unquote, not focusing on basketball, not really knowing what his day-to-day looks like. So that's another problem I have, right? Like, this isn't, I don't think a player's podcast gives any indication on how much effort they give on and off the court. I believe that's like the equivalent of saying NBA players shouldn't watch Sunday Night Football, because realistically, like Dre said, they're not editing their own podcast. They're probably just recording. Maybe they're setting like an additional hour and a half throughout the week to plan the episode, if that, because even in most cases they have a producer who's kind of pulling all the strings behind the scenes, getting all the guests on board. So realistically, this is like a 2 to 3 hour commitment throughout your week. So that's why I bring up the Sunday Night Football example, because that's more or less how long a game takes. Like, if you saw your favorite athlete, if you saw LeBron, I'm picking on LeBron because he posts Sunday Night Football or just football games pretty consistently. He'll post like he's watching football the entire day on the day where he's not playing. Nobody's coming at LeBron, and I get that's also LeBron himself, but like, no one is gonna think twice if they see a player watching another sport, like, or if they see watching, I know lots of NBA players are soccer fans, right? No one's gonna come at a Josh Hart for watching a Chelsea game on a Saturday morning and say, yo, get to work, get to the gym, put some shots up, So that's my problem. Like Dre said, it's 100% results based, and I think people are just finding a reason to criticize a player for trying to make another avenue of income, which I'm personally never gonna. I'm all for players getting paid. I'm all for them making their money. And when it's something like this, where it's actually them leaning into the game that they play and showcasing their passion for the sport, I can't be mad at it. So those are just my thoughts. But I don't know if you guys have additional comments.
But I don't know, because like, I feel like I kind of disagree with that point, actually, where if you're an athlete, you're already getting paid millions of dollars a year for playing with a ball, playing a sport at the highest level, which, that's a blessing in and of itself. And so with that, I feel like when you're in that position, ideally I would want to see players, like, for teams I support, like in soccer, like, I want to see them focused. I don't want to see my favorite player, albeit I might love them on the pitch, I don't want to see them coming out talking about, random stuff or even about the game, because I don't care about their perspective being shared out to the public, because I feel like inherently that's just damaging for their focus on the game, and that is their main job. Their main job is not to be an entertainer. We have, talk show hosts. We have players who have retired for that, like pundits and that sort of thing. So I just feel like at the end of the day, they're a pro athlete. It's already a great job. Just do that. Like, bro, we're doing this podcast, bro, but I don't got a job. So I got the time and the effort to be able to do this, There was something else I wanted to say too. Shoot. Whatever.
Yeah, if you remember, just jump in. But I can see that, and I think I'm probably somewhere in the middle. I think if it in any way is detrimental, even slightly detrimental to your main job, which pays you way more than however much you're going to get paid from Spotify and YouTube, whatever, for your podcast, and like the actual bosses you have to respond to, then you got to cut it, because at the end of the day, they're paying you hundreds of millions of dollars, and your YouTube is still probably going to pay you thousands of dollars, but like it's not comparable. And these are people who are paying you rather than you getting paid by YouTube, which is not really the same thing. So if it's in any way detrimental, then I agree you have to cut it. But if it's not too, if it's like I described earlier, and it's not too out of the way, I don't have much of a problem with it. But I do have a distinction in terms of the subject matter of the podcast, because like you said, Alexi, with certain things regarding the actual game, I think you can lead that to like you said, retired players. I think if you're a current player, if you want to hop on a podcast and just talk about fun stories, or like even fun stories regarding the NBA, or like maybe if you want to get on there and talk about TV or something, I don't know, anything your interest and things like that, that's cool. Like, I feel like you shouldn't be stopped from doing that.
I'm gonna pause you there.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna interrupt. I feel like even if you're doing that, you are making a presence for yourself that inherently makes you stand out from your teammates, from your team, and gives you an individual persona that makes you more of an entertainer. I feel like I'm going a bit deep into this, but I feel like just from an optics point of view, at that point, you're no longer just a player. You are someone, a multifaceted person, which, I mean, every person is, but you're showing that entertainment is almost as much as a priority just by putting that out there, I feel like.
But I think
if they want, like, I get, but I'm just saying for the point of being good for the team and for winning at the end of the day, I don't think that's the best route.
I think you can look at it from either the organization's perspective or the player's perspective. I think from the organization, you make good points. I think from the player's perspective, because their career can end tomorrow, and you get the career-ending injury, I can understand them wanting to set up other avenues for themselves to have a life beyond the NBA or beyond soccer or whatever the sport is, other than maybe baseball, because the guaranteed money in baseball is ridiculous. And no one wants to hear you talk about baseball either. But like, other than that, like, I can understand them being like, okay, even though I'm Paul George, I'm making millions of dollars in the NBA, and he actually did have a really bad injury in his past, and that could have been the end of him, and luckily he recovered. But say like tomorrow something, God forbid, happened, at least he can be like, okay, well, I still have Podcast P, and I still have a career in this beyond just being a player. And that's going to happen to all of them eventually, not just through injury, but through retirement. And like you said, I agree, you can wait until retirement and then start something up, but I can understand them wanting to lay that foundation, especially because some of them are probably angling to become pundits in some capacity in the future.
Yeah, but I remember what I was going to say. But that sets a precedent then, that once you have one or two players in a league doing this, next season it's going to be 3 or 4. Season after that, it's going to be 10. And then there's just going to be the expectation that as a player, you also need to do these things, I think. I think that's my problem, is that it will fundamentally change the idea of what a player is for an organization. that I think in the end will negatively impact, at the end of the day, winning games.
Interesting. Okay. What I will say, and I'm going to go back to that like 3-hour example, right? Like, I have often heard people say like, well, they should be training instead. Like, like you should be putting up shots. You should be working on your game. I think realistically, yes, 3 hours is a lot of time, but 3 hours a week, like, I don't know if you really boil it down, that's somewhere around, that's like less than 30 minutes a day, right? So if you do the math, it's like less than 30 minutes per day. I don't think the amount of training that you do in that time will be enough to, in this case, since we're talking about Paul George, to get the Sixers back on the winning column, right? Like, I don't think in any way it turns their season around. I think right now the Sixers have much bigger issues, and people are using Paul George as a scapegoat because he's putting his face on social media, because he's putting out those podcast episodes. So I see where the criticism comes from, but I just realistically don't think product on the court changes that much if you take the pod away. And that's the first thing. And I had something else, but I also forgot. But that's just how I feel. Like, I don't think the integrity of the game is really affected, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And the other thing I was going to say too, just to add on to that, was that although I do agree with you in the sense that, like, if it's about random stuff, that I don't mind, although maybe that's probably not why people want to tune into them. And to that point too, like, you still have to be entertaining, and you still have to probably be a certain level of player for people even to care about what you have to say to begin with. But I do think if they're talking about current day NBA and like everyday storylines and stuff that are going on in the NBA, like they might talk about on ESPN, there I do have an issue, because I think talking about the game, I'm not talking about like X's and O's, which even then that's kind of weird, talking about X's and O's while you're playing, but which is like what LeBron was doing with JJ Redick. But if you're talking about like current storylines in the NBA while you're currently playing in the NBA, I do think that can kind of blur the lines between, like, okay, obviously they're all aware of it, but like having being public and talking about it, and I can see that actually reflecting on your mindset and your play more than just like talking about random stuff. So if it's stuff like that, then I think that becomes a bit more of a gray area.
That's a fair point. But I'll give you an example. When the Luka trade happened, I wanted to hear what players had to say about it, because at the end of the day, what I like about the NBA is that a lot of the players are very clear about, like, no, like, I'm also a fan. Obviously, I'm a player, but I'm also a fan of the sport, just like you are. So obviously, I will come out and say, even though I haven't said it outright, I can acknowledge that I'm being biased in my take. I'm someone who, I've previously said, I love listening to sports podcasts. I have listened to Podcast P before. What an Experience with Lonzo Ball. Trae Young's podcast is really good. There's like lots of current podcasts that I've watched and that I've enjoyed. And I think I enjoy seeing, like, okay, like, so-and-so is just as much of a fan as I am, and I want to hear what they have to say. So that's part of the reason why I do enjoy it. But I'm going to take it back to the comment I said about, we live in an age where it's so easy for a narrative to be created. There's so many narratives. I don't want to go down the laundry list, but I've seen on the Knicks podcast with the Roommate Show, Jalen Brunson talk about how people don't think he's a superstar. And I think his posture, I know Alexi said it shows that they may be not focused on the game. If anything, I will watch Jalen Brunson speak on the game, and I'm like, nah, this guy's dialed in. Like, this guy does not care what the people have to say, and he's just using his platform to say, like, I'll just let my game do the talking, right? And that's something that I really respect, and I think it's needed because we live in an age that's so centered on headlines and Twitter posts and just clickbait, and a lot of people who don't watch the game and will run with narrative. You got Stephen A on on First Take making crazy comments and people will run with them. Like Kawhi Leonard is the worst superstar who's ever existed. Kyrie Irving should retire right now. You know, these are all like quotes that he has come out with, and people will go on and run with these because they hear someone with a reputation say them. And I think this is all to say, I think we live in such a toxic media age where I feel like the NBA podcast kind of offset that toxicity.
I think I could see what you're saying about offsetting that, but I don't think that's a solution still. Like, I would argue, I'd maybe agree, I guess, in that there's a bigger issue just with how the media covers sport and, you know, how we as individuals talk about sport on social media. That players having to have their own podcast shouldn't be the solution to that negativity.
It's very fair. It's fair. Cool. Any other comments?
No, I think that was a good one. I think it's good that we disagree. I think this is generally a very polarizing topic that splits a lot of fans down the middle. I think maybe potentially in results-oriented fashion. Like, some fans are probably like, I love it when my player, like you, probably saying, I love it when that I get to hear my favorite players talk. The Knicks are a good team, and maybe there are people who, like, if the Knicks were bad, they were like, I don't want to hear this, but you never know. So I think it's good that we disagree. I think I want to hear in the comments too, you know, people think where they fall on this. Like, do they agree with this, disagree, agree with Alexi, agree with me, agree with you? I feel like we're all slightly on different parts of the spectrum on this, so I'll be very curious to hear what people have to say.
For sure.